104 BC. The heart of Central Asia, the eastern reaches of the Ferghana Valley. The city-state of Yucheng, a bastion on the eastern frontier of the kingdom of Dayuan. Beneath this formidable fortress carved into the mountainside, thousands of exhausted, starving Han soldiers gazed in despair at the massive walls of hewn stone. Deprived of siege engines and skilled engineers, the Han army found it nearly impossible to breach a stronghold they had never anticipated. As the Han ranks wavered in indecision, the massive gates suddenly groaned open. An infantry phalanx, unlike anything the Han soldiers had ever witnessed, emerged from the gateway. They held massive shields, some oval, some perfectly circular, and gripped pikes taller than a man. They marched in a formation as dense as dragon scales, advancing step by step to the rhythmic beat of a war drum. Seeing the enemy venture out for a pitched battle, the Han commanders immediately ordered their crossbowmen to fire. The Han soldiers, masters of the heavy crossbow, unleashed a deluge of bolts. Yet, even this iron rain failed to break the heavy spear phalanx from the front. Though some bore Asian features, many among them were outsiders with deep-set eyes and sharp profiles. Braving the storm of arrows and bracing behind their great shields, they pressed toward the Han lines with the steady, chilling cadence of the drum. As the distance closed, the Han army ordered a charge. Close-quarter infantry, armed with ring-pommel sabers and hook shields, lunged forward to engage. But they could not penetrate the disciplined shield wall of their opponents. Instead, they were met by long spears thrusting from behind the barrier, falling one by one. With the melee assault failing, the Han halberdier units were pushed to the front. However, lacking shield protection and crippled by the hunger and fatigue of their long march, their formations were ragged and their morale low. They were simply no match for these heavy infantrymen defending their home. Every charge left a carpet of blood and bodies before the shield wall. The phalanx moved like an indifferent juggernaut, its synchronized steps grinding the Han army's breathing room into dust. Simultaneously, from the towering Hellenistic walls of Yucheng, a rain of arrows and heavy projectiles poured down like a monsoon, mercilessly harvesting the Han soldiers forced back by the phalanx. Adding to the suffocating terror of the battlefield, unknown numbers of nomadic cavalry could be seen gathering on the riverbanks and steppes beyond the city. These were the Kangju riders from the north of Dayuan. They were no allies of the Han. The only question was, when would they launch their flanking maneuver? In this desperate and stifling tactical nightmare, the Han commander, General Li Guangli, was forced to sound the retreat. The remaining thousands of Han soldiers withdrew under covering fire, gradually disengaging from the field. The outnumbered garrison of Yucheng did not pursue, allowing them to retreat into the vast Gobi Desert and toward the Pamir Plateau, the roof of the world that had swallowed countless travelers before them. This stands as a recorded clash between Hellenistic military power and Chinese forces in both Chinese chronicles and Western accounts. Let us turn the clock back 200 years to understand how this seemingly impossible collision came to be. In 329 BC, Alexander the Great's invincible expeditionary force pushed the imperial frontier to the Ferghana Valley. At the very edge of the known world, Alexander established a fortress city, Alexandria Eschate, Alexandria the furthest. In the long years following Alexander's sudden death, his generals and their descendants clung to this land, establishing the Greco-Bactrian kingdom that spanned Central Asia. Over time, this remote enclave evolved in isolation. The Greeks blended with local nomads and Iranian-speaking peoples, birthing a unique hybrid civilization. By the time the wheels of history reached 100 BC, this fertile basin had transformed into the kingdom of Dayuan. Though geographically severed from their Mediterranean motherland, the people of Dayuan still forged heavy armor in bronze, crafted fine wine beneath the vineyard trellises of the oases, and, crucially, still trained their infantry according to the tactical manuals left by the Macedonian conquerors. Dayuan was a Hellenistic island of war, preserved by time in the depths of Central Asia. While the descendants of the Greeks were polishing their spears in the far west, the Far East was locked in a long and bloody struggle for survival. For decades, the Han Empire, ruling the fertile plains of East Asia, lived under a massive, suffocating shadow, the Xiongnu. This vast, predatory nomadic empire was the undisputed hegemon of the Eurasian steppe. Their horse archers were like the winter wind, tearing through the Han borders with devastating speed, pillaging cities and vanishing into the boundless northern wilderness before the empire's massive but slow infantry could react. When Emperor Wu ascended to the pinnacle of power, he resolutely tore up the decades-old policy of appeasement and defense. He sought to launch a total, systemic, strategic counter-offensive. But to defeat the wind, one must harness a faster wind. Emperor Wu keenly realized that traditional infantry and chariots were like sacrificial lambs on the vast grasslands. The Han Empire had to build a heavy cavalry capable of meeting the nomadic overlords in head-on combat. This meant he needed horses, not the small, hardy Mongolian ponies of the steppe, but the heavenly horses, tall, muscled steeds capable of carrying armored knights through enemy lines. This desperate thirst for strategic resources forced Emperor Wu to turn his gaze toward the empire's western fringes, to the vast unknown known as the Western regions. At that time, the Western regions, today's Tarim Basin, were a fragmented patchwork of oasis city-states scattered like pearls along the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, the Sea of Death. For ages, these fragile states had been gripped by the Xiongnu, serving as the nomadic empire's economic blood bank. The Xiongnu extracted grain and wealth with cruelty to fuel their war machine against the Han. In Emperor Wu's grand strategic vision, the western regions were the pivotal move on a giant chessboard. Opening the way to the west meant more than just severing the right wing of the Xiongnu and destroying their economic lifeline. It meant searching for the divine treasures of the far west. When the legendary envoy Zhang Qian returned to Chang'an after 13 years of captivity and near-death escapes, he brought back more than just a geopolitical blueprint. He brought intelligence that would alter the course of history. In the extreme west lay the fortified kingdom of Dayuan, home to the blood-sweating heavenly steeds. And so the cogs of fate began their irreversible interlocking. Two historical trajectories that should have remained forever parallel were forced onto a collision course by an invisible hand, crossing 2 centuries of time and thousands of miles of desolation. On one side was the immortal military legacy of Alexander the Great, taking root in the Ferghana Valley, maintaining the cold majesty of the classical era within its stone walls and rigid phalanxes. On the other was the absolute will of Emperor Wu to reshape the destiny of his empire, an Eastern power locked in a life-or-death struggle, letting out a roar for the strategic resources that would allow it to dominate the battlefield. History's fuse is often laid long in advance. It takes only a spark, seemingly insignificant, to ignite the inferno. Initially, Emperor Wu of Han had no intention of launching a total war across thousands of miles. For a mature empire, paving a road with gold is far cheaper than opening a path with blood. Thus, a high-stakes diplomatic mission departed from Chang'an. They carried not only mountains of silk and jewels, but also a life-sized horse cast in solid gold. In the eyes of the Han Empire, this was not merely a trade. It was an imperial grace that could not be refused. Yet, upon the throne of Dayuan sat King Mugua, a man of profound arrogance. Basking in the mild breezes of the Ferghana Valley, The ruling elite of Dayuan remained blissfully ignorant of the power rising in the east. They looked at the map, saw the impossibly long supply lines, and reached a fatal conclusion. The Han armies could never survive the crossing of the Sea of Death, the deserts, and the Gobi. Facing the assertive Han envoys, the Dayuan court rejected the deal with contempt. Humiliated, the Han envoy erupted in fury, smashing the glittering golden horse in open court before sweeping out in a rage. To the people of Dayuan, this was an intolerable affront. As the Han mission journeyed home and reached the eastern border town of Yucheng, the Dayuan military struck. The Han envoys were brutally slaughtered, and their vast treasures were plundered. The shifting sands buried the bones of the envoys, but the smoke of this blood debt drifted 10,000 miles, curling directly into the heart of the Weiyang Palace in Chang'an. For a superpower at the peak of its expansion, there was no crime more unforgivable than the murder of its envoys. This was no longer a deal for a few horses. It was a public desecration of the Han Empire's dignity. Emperor Wu's fury was fully ignited. In 104 BC, Emperor Wu appointed Li Guangli, the brother of his favorite concubine, as the general of Eschate, named after the very city rumored to be the breeding ground of Dayuan's finest steeds. However, the Han Empire committed a fatal strategic miscalculation. Accustomed to large-scale cavalry warfare against the Xiongnu in the north, the Han leadership severely underestimated the logistical nightmare of projecting power to the far west. They naively assumed that the small city-states of the western regions would surrender at the mere sight of the army and provide ample supplies. Consequently, the tens of thousands dispatched to Dayuan were not the empire's elite field legions, but a motley force of pardoned convicts, young frontier mercenaries, and 6,000 light cavalry from surrendered Xiongnu and other vassal states. It was an expedition predestined for tragedy. When Li Guangli's army entered the Taklamakan Desert, they found that the oasis city-states along the route did not open their gates as expected. Instead, fearing this massive eastern host would drain their precious water, they barred their gates and stood ready for battle. Imagine, in a desert of extreme temperature swings, without sufficient baggage trains or even water, the Han soldiers were forced to halt before every locked oasis to wage desperate siege warfare just to survive. If they won, they had a meal and a drink of muddy well water. If they failed, they had to drag their weakening bodies toward the next unknown city-state days away. This was not an expedition. It was a slow, agonizing disintegration. Every inch of the westward path was paved with the bones of Han soldiers who fell to thirst, hunger, and disease. By the time this ghost-like army spent months trekking through hell, crossing the Pamir Plateau to reach the border city of Yucheng, the original force of tens of thousands had withered away to a mere few thousand. What followed was the suffocating collision described at the start. This gaunt, ragged remnant of an Eastern army crashed headlong into the well-rested, heavily equipped Hellenistic Phalanx. Beneath the towering stone walls of Yucheng, before a forest of pikes, the desperate charges of the Han soldiers turned into pools of blood before the shields. This was more than a tactical defeat. It was the climax of a nightmare. Gazing at the insurmountable walls and the Hellenistic army that moved like a cold machine, Li Guangli realized that further fighting meant only leaving everyone's corpses in the wilderness. He gave the agonizing order to retreat. The road back was even more merciless than the journey there. By the time Li Guangli led his surviving soldiers back to the strategic stronghold of Dunhuang on the Han border, less than 20% of his original force remained. Li Guangli sent a messenger to Chang'an, pleading for permission to enter the safety of the Jade Gate Pass to regroup and wait for reinforcements. But in the Weiyang Palace, Emperor Wu felt no pity for the broken survivors, only unprecedented rage and humiliation. If an army that could not even conquer Dayuan were allowed to retreat into the heartland, the prestige of the Han Empire across the western regions would vanish. The wavering city-states and the ever-watchful Xiongnu would not hesitate to drive Han influence out of the land forever. The emperor's will was as cold as iron. Emperor Wu immediately issued a decree that chilled the bones of all: seal the Jade Gate Pass. He dispatched an executioner with the imperial sword to stand at the gateway. Any soldier or officer who dared to retreat even half a step into the pass was to be beheaded on the spot. Shut out from their homeland, Li Guangli and his remnants could only camp in the bitter northwest wind, waiting in the desolation of Dunhuang. The first war with Dayuan ended in disgrace for the Han Empire. But the people of Dayuan could not have known that they had not repelled Han ambition. They had awakened an eastern juggernaut in the throes of absolute fury. This was no longer an armed parade for horses. A terrifying vengeance, fueled by the total resources of the empire, had begun. Emperor Wu made a decision that baffled his contemporaries: to mobilize the entire nation for a war of total annihilation. In 102 BC, when the massive gates of the Jade Gate Pass thundered open toward the west once more, what appeared was no longer the starving makeshift force of 3 years prior, but a war machine armed to the teeth. 60,000 fully equipped Han regulars marched forth. Among them were veteran frontier cavalry with over 50 mid-level officers, colonels, leading the way. While the numbers were not astronomical, their lethality was terrifying. Under a miles-long canopy of crimson war banners, the army surged forward. Accompanying them were 100,000 oxen for supplies and food, 30,000 horses for riding and transport, and tens of thousands of camels and donkeys. This was no longer just an army. It was a massive, mobile city in the sea of sand. Behind this vanguard, another 180,000 armored troops were stationed in Dunhuang and surrounding areas to guarantee the absolute security of the supply lines. To solve the lethal water crisis of the previous expedition, the Han ranks included a specialized corps, hydraulic engineers and master well diggers. Emperor Wu gave them a cold and direct mission. If the oasis states dared to lock their gates again, the Han would no longer waste time on walls. They would either cut off the city's water source entirely or drill deep wells into the desert floor to sustain the imperial army's siege with an endless flow of groundwater. As this unstoppable torrent of steel poured into the edges of the Taklamakan, the kings of the western regions trembled on their battlements. This was a force of terror far beyond the last. They had to weigh their choices carefully or face total erasure. A small oasis state named Luntai made a fatal choice. They closed their gates, refusing even a single grain to the eastern beast. Li Guangli did not hesitate. The Han army did not even bother sending envoys to call for surrender. They immediately deployed heavy siege engines. Under a cover of crossbow bolts as thick as locusts, the defenses of Luntai crumbled instantly. On the day the city fell, Li Guangli gave his bloodiest order: slaughter the city. The Han Empire used the spilling of blood to tell every city-state, "Give us your grain, or give us your heads." This brutal object lesson worked instantly. As the news of Luntai's annihilation spread like a plague through the desert, not a single gate dared to close before the invincible Han host. From Kucha to Gumo, the princes and kings of the western regions knelt outside their cities, funneling water and fodder into the army camps. A logistical lifeline across the Sea of Death was forcibly opened through absolute violence. The Han advance was a juggernaut. With high morale and in far better health than 3 years prior, they once again scaled the treacherous Pamirs. When the crimson tide of Han banners flooded over the mountain ridges and poured into the Ferghana Valley like divine soldiers from the heavens, Mu Gua, the ruler of Dayuan, finally woke from his dream. They had thought the vast deserts and deadly plateaus were impassable barriers. They had thought the few thousand survivors from 3 years ago represented the limit of Han power. Now, seeing the disciplined, endless legions on the horizon, the glint of their weapons blinding to the eye, they realized what kind of terror they had awakened. This time, Li Guangli had learned his lesson in blood. As the army approached the eastern gateway of Yucheng, he did not dull his vanguard against its walls. He coldly detached a secondary force to pin down the garrison like a nail, then led the tens of thousands of Han elite infantry and cavalry to bypass the border. Like a heavy sword aimed at the heart, he struck directly at the capital of Dayuan, the city of Guishan. Guishan, the city of the morning light, founded over 2 centuries ago by Alexander the Great. It was the strongest bastion of Hellenistic civilization in Central Asia and the seat of Dayuan's power. In 101 BC, the Han Expeditionary Force, having crossed 10,000 miles of yellow sand and frozen peaks, finally drew up its ranks beneath the walls of Guishan. Before them stood the ancient, towering stone walls left by Alexander. Atop those walls, the finest Hellenistic soldiers of Dayuan gripped their pikes, looking down upon the earth that was about to be stained red. Years of diplomatic deceit, bloody massacres, desert marches, and long waiting had finally reached the endgame. There was no retreat and no need for words. The heavy Han crossbows, the pinnacle of ancient Eastern lethal power, were being drawn slow and steady in the front ranks. Within the city, the Macedonian Phalanx had already formed its dense, bristling ranks. 2 of the ancient world's most formidable war machines from the east and the west were about to engage in a final showdown under the Central Asian sun to decide the course of history. Beneath the walls of Guishan, history held its breath. Faced with the Han legions at their gates, the Hellenistic infantry of Dayuan surged from their massive stone portals, hoping to reenact the classic tactical victory they had achieved at Yucheng 3 years prior. But this time, they did not face a starving, broken remnant. They stood before the Han Empire's field army at its absolute zenith, the pinnacle of Eastern military might. On the open plains, the Han commander Li Guangli chose not to pit his infantry against the forest of Macedonian pikes. Instead, he unleashed the most devastating long-range weapon of the ancient world, the Han heavy crossbow. Accompanied by the bone-chilling thrum of 10,000 vibrating bowstrings, clouds of armor-piercing bolts rose like black veils, shrieking through the air before slamming into the dense Dayuan phalanxes. Against this overwhelming saturation of firepower, even the sturdiest bronze shield wall could not withstand the monsoon of iron. Lacking the mobility to close the gap, the Dayuan infantry became little more than sitting ducks for a weapon that exceeded their defensive limits. Under this relentless barrage, the phalanx shattered, and the survivors fled in chaos behind their towering stone walls. With open battle lost, the people of Dayuan pinned their last hopes on the formidable fortifications left by the era of Alexander the Great. But the Han had anticipated this. Their hydraulic engineers moved immediately to divert the river flowing through Guishan, severing the city's surface water supply. History seemed poised for a quick surrender, yet it recorded a dramatic twist. Somewhere within the walls of Guishan were Qin people, men of Chinese origin, who taught the Dayuan defenders the art of digging deep wells to tap into the subterranean water table. The siege turned into a brutal war of attrition. Li Guangli ordered his engineers to deploy massive siege engines, but the resilient Hellenistic infantry fought back with grim determination from the battlements, their shields and pikes holding the line. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, a decisive breakthrough remained elusive. Knowing Emperor Wu would never grant him a second chance at failure, Li Guangli grew desperate. He ignored the mounting death toll, throwing wave after wave of soldiers into the assault with cold indifference to human life. Day and night, the Han heavy engines hammered the walls. A tide of Han soldiers, treading over the bodies of their fallen comrades, launched continuous suicide charges. After 40 days in this meat grinder of blood and stone, the Han vanguard finally filled the moats with their very lives and breached the outer defenses of Guishan. Jianmi, the greatest champion of Dayuan, was defeated and captured in the desperate street fighting that followed. The Han army surged in like a crimson flood, compressing the remaining defenders and the royal family into the final inner citadel. The shadow of total annihilation loomed over Dayuan. Inside the inner city, water was failing, granaries were empty, and outside, the Han were already constructing even more lethal siege engines. The nobility of Dayuan finally broke under the weight of their terror. To save themselves, they launched a bloody internal coup. They stormed the palace and put the arrogant King Mu Gua, the man who had sparked this catastrophe, to the sword. Shortly after, an envoy emerged from the gates carrying the king's severed head and a white flag. They offered the Han a final ultimatum. Take the head of the instigator, take all the heavenly horses you desire, and provide the army with grain. But if the slaughter continued, they would kill every horse and die amidst the ruins of their civilization. Li Guangli finally halted. Dayuan had bowed. The dignity of the empire was restored. The horses were within reach. He saw no need to waste more lives on a heap of rubble. The Han accepted the surrender. Accompanied by imperial equine experts, the Han selected dozens of top-tier blood-sweating stallions and 3,000 additional breeding stock. This expeditionary force, having finally secured the strategic treasure they had dreamed of, installed a pro-Han king and began the long journey home. As Guishan fell, the city of Yucheng, which had held out for so long, was also finally breached. Carrying 3 years of pent-up vengeance, the Han soldiers struck the walls like a violent storm. Faced with absolute power and the relentless will of a superpower, Yucheng's defenses disintegrated. The Lord of Yucheng, who had ordered the massacre of the Han envoys years before, fled toward the northern kingdom of Kangju. But the Han cavalry followed like shadows, eventually forcing the Kangju to hand him over. During the forced march back, a common Han rider personally decapitated the man. This blood debt, spanning 3 years, was finally settled in the ruins of Yucheng. Yet in the echoes of this grand epic, history leaves a bitter, realistic postscript. As the victorious legions marched east, the clouds over Dayuan did not truly dissipate. This land, steeped in Hellenistic culture, retained its defiant core. Almost as soon as the Han dust settled, the Dayuan nobility launched a second coup, executed the Han-appointed King Meikai, and placed Mu Gua's brother on the throne. Facing this provocative breach of contract, Emperor Wu, though furious, was forced to swallow the bitter truth. The Han war machine had reached the absolute physical limit of its power projection. To support these 2 expeditions across 10,000 miles, the Han had exhausted vast granaries and the imperial treasury. Tens of thousands of soldiers, laborers, and livestock lay buried in the shifting sands and frozen peaks. With the northern front still demanding constant vigilance against the Xiongnu, even the great Emperor Wu could not afford a third Sea of Death crossing. The Han Empire was forced to accept an imperfect compromise. and the most somber footnote of all concerns the very treasures the empire had bled for, the heavenly horses. When Li Guangli left Dayuan, he led a proud train of 3,000 elite steeds. But the return journey, which had been a crucible for the soldiers, proved a purgatory for these creatures of the fertile valleys. The oxygen-depleted Pamirs, the scorched Taklamakan, and the lack of fodder claimed them one by one. The legendary horses died in droves amidst the sand and gravel. When Li Guangli's weathered banners finally appeared on the horizon of the Jade Gate Pass, the great cavalry train was a ghost of its former self. Of the 3,000 horses taken from Dayuan, only 1,000 survived to step onto Han soil. And of the 60,000 soldiers who had marched out in glory, barely 10,000 lived to see the moon over their homeland again. This was the true conclusion of the first great collision between East and West. There was no cost-free triumph, no perfect conquest, only a Pyrrhic victory written in bone. The military legacy of Alexander the Great and the sweeping expansionism of Emperor Wu both found their limits against the cruel reality of geography. But it was not in vain. Those 1,000 surviving horses and the nameless bones left in the wind bridged the gap between the two ends of Eurasia in the most tragic and heroic way possible. On this imperial corridor forged in blood and obsession, the clash of swords would eventually fade, replaced by the steady, rhythmic chime of camel bells that would endure for 2,000 years.